I'm just giving a minute for my co-chair to arrive. Ken, Marcia's not in the waiting room by any chance, is she?
No, not yet.
Okay.
Good morning.
Good morning, Paquita. Good to see you.
Good to see everybody.
All right. Well, I think we will begin since it's 10 o'clock and we have quite a full agenda for today. Hopefully, Dr. Marcia Bryant will be joining us in just a few minutes. So I now convene the Early Childhood Workforce Development Task Force to order. And just want to give an overview of today's plan, and then we'll get started. So we are going to spend the first part of our gathering together with Paige Bray and Stephen Hegedus sharing a little bit about the CT Consortium for the Advancement of Early Childhood Educators grant. And then we will have a block of time for our two presenters, Steve Marcelinus and Mary Harrell. And then the last part of our time together, we will have an opportunity for subcommittee reflections, for people to pose any questions or things that we would like for the whole task force to share any perspectives around. So that is our plan for today, and I will turn us over to Paige whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Jessica. So people might have a little bit of a sense of this. Stephen's going to speak to the partnership and statewide context, but the grant proposal for the Connecticut's Consortium for the Advancement of Early Childhood Educators was a statewide reaching effort to address the 35,000-ish children born and in Connecticut in the 0 to 6 space. We know that there's closer to like 300,000 in the 0 to age 8. And we were looking at the history of the credentials offered by the Office of Early Childhood, which is the ECTC, or the Early Childhood Teaching Credential, which serves school readiness and lead teacher work in the non-public school sector. And the Connecticut State Department endorsements the 112, which is 0 to 5 or birth to nursery, and then the 113, which is pre-K to or nursery to grade 3. That language is a bit dated, but it's what the license says. And so how we can look at this space of the 0 to 6 and include all of the pathways from the registry and the ECTC as well as SDE to really understand this space. We know this task force is focusing on compensation as one of the key levers and factors, but that we want to think about how a human being coming into the early childhood workforce can navigate her or his way through career ladder, pay scale, but also just opportunities to learn and contribute across their time. One of the pieces of data that I think is helpful from what we pulled for the grant, it was that the demographics from SDE from 2014 to 19 was that which is the same time frame that the ECTC was available. 70% of the 113s, those are the pre-K to grade 3, also were interested in completing the ECTC, but the diversity was much greater with the ECTC in terms of the And this is all in the document that will wind up in our repository when we are clear where that is. So that's in terms of access. And the other piece of information that we really wanted to just highlight from the grant before Stephen speaks to the network is really like, what problem are we trying to solve? We really tapped into the notion of the national efforts happening from NACI and the unifying framework of the profession. So understanding that's not just educators and not just inclusive educators, both in coming from regular early childhood and special education for typical and atypical students, but also all of the what once upon a time was called allied professions, right? Speech, OT, everything that we see in the birth to 3 system, and how to understand that connection. I think that the only other little piece of data that's helpful here at a glance is we just did a little bit of trying to understand our capacity. We know this goes back and forth, and we know we have a loop of we need more capacity, but then when we seemingly realize we need it very quickly. And so how does higher ed and other pathway, and all pathways meet that need? So the unofficial sort of count of people working with a certificate in the 112 was for the age span was 50, for the pre-K grade 3 was 36, for elementary 36, for special ed K-12 15. So part of what the grant was looking at is how this early childhood relates to elementary, and how the integrated early childhood, which we have here in the state of Connecticut, also interacts with the 165, which is the special ed certification. I think that's as deep as I can get at a high level. Again, this will be available to everybody in the portal. Stephen, do you want to say more about the sort of reach and depth of the partnerships and stakeholders?
Certainly. Thanks. Thank you, Paige. Good morning, everybody. Good to see everyone. I would also offer, within the context of our work here now, that this grant proposal came from a call from a foundation that was focused on reform in early childhood, and it was quite a response in a short period of time to get a group of people, of institutions in Connecticut on board, not just the state university space and the community colleges, but also private centers and key partners, as well as our Commissioner Beth By, the Office of Early Childhood, and at the time Commissioner Cardona of the State Department of Ed, who both wrote supporting letters. We got through to the second round, and we're very encouraged. And there was quite a bit of money that would have been used to support our efforts. We were finalists, but we didn't get through. But looking back at that work, that was two or 3 years ago now, Paige. There is a lot there, as Paige has just mentioned, that could be a resource to this group. Some of you were part of writing it as well. I think fundamental to that is the spirit of a collaborative work, a consortium. And actually, one of the expectations in there was really the establishment of some kind of policy or task force, and where we're here today. So we've sort of got one of the end outcomes. We managed to at least start in by the establishment of this task force through legislation. And that really was when we found we weren't going to get the support, talking to our Senator McCrory and Representative Sanchez about the ultimate goal, because there has to be a lot of considerate thought and planning within this space. The only thing I'd add, apart from there is a lot of data, some will need to be updated, of course, since it was written a couple of years ago. But at the heart of it is, what are the main what are the main challenges you're trying to address? What are the, what problems we're trying to solve? What are the fundamentals of teacher preparation in your institution? What are the alternative routes within that to support EC educators getting high quality education? And talking about the pathways from community colleges as well. What are the challenges and barriers that need to be overcome to create real change that is of a collaborative nature? What are the populations we're aiming to serve and barriers that they currently encounter, and how that might be addressed? And how are we uniquely positioned, which I think is a very important question, to serve a racially, ethnically, and linguistically diverse student population and community? And how are we addressing equity and inclusivity into the design of our work? So there is quite a bit of work there that may help in us formulating our recommendations. So I myself and Paige were co-PIs and co-developers of that, and I believe that's why I'm here today. So we'll share that and see if there's anything that within that we can build on as a resource. Any questions? Okay, is that enough? Is that sufficient for the time? Because I know we have presenters today. Jessica.
I would just want to supportively highlight for all of us that figuring maybe by the end of this meeting or just following it, just clarifying our data request process is where that is happening slowly. And again, this document is this place to start, and that there's even some things to update. Obviously, there may be other pieces. And we have some clarity on that, I think, as the co-chairs know, but making sure we quickly get everyone on board with that. Appreciate it.
Yeah, the one last thing, I'm just, I had some notes, I'm just refreshing my, one last thing that was important in the questions they were asking us is how do we plan to incorporate the various voices, educator voice in the community and the employers in design and implementation. And the more I've been involved in this work, that is I believe, really critical in our collaboration. Thank you.
I have a question. Is any of this information disaggregated in any way, setting, racial demographics that you cited?
I think that is a great question. We did not necessarily have it disaggregated, and it doesn't necessarily come that way.
Okay.
And so I think to me, that's an example of where we can see, is there better data? And if there isn't, why don't we have it? And how do we navigate that?
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Bai?
Thank you. I really appreciate that question, because during the pandemic, Paquita, we wondered that same thing and realized our registry did not have enough data in that area. So we have added that to our registry, or in the process. A lot of times these IT things take a while for the developers, but it is a weakness because we do want to maintain the diversity of our workforce. And as things shift and change, we want to be able to make sure that those changes over time are not in a direction that reduces that. I think as we look at early childhood getting more federal funding, hopefully, and things changing, we need, and I would hope this committee would recommend some kind of tracking of demographic data so we can be sure that we're not losing that in early childhood. So I really appreciate that question. I think we should just make a note for recommendations that both SDE and OEC collect that data and report I don't know, report it to the legislature or some way to avoid sort of what happened in the 40s and 50s in public education as they grew and started. And George is on the line. Georgia, you point this out to me all the time to say, you have real and very valid concerns about what happens when the funding comes. I like to say when, though my Lucy and the football experience for 35 years has me saying if. But we have to be prepared before it comes, and we have to be tracking this before it comes. So thanks for that question.
Meryl, go ahead.
I just had a clarifying question about those numbers that Paige mentioned. Those were the number of people in programs pursuing those different certificates or certifications? You're muted.
That was too many windows open at the same moment, Meryl. Thank you for the question. I'm just going back to the document so that I have the same. Yeah, it was for certified people.
It's the unofficial count of staff working with that certification, 112, 113, 65, 165 in those areas.
So those are people working with that certification, not people who are pursuing the certification.
Correct.
Okay.
Thank you, Stephen, for getting faster.
Yeah, that's a really difficult question to answer, though.
Yeah.
And because we're supplying data on completers. I mean, that would take a different kind of collaboration to know how many are in the pipeline.
Right. I think the state of the early childhood field is that we've seen a lot of exodus of staff. In some places, public schools have really drained the local early childhood programs, where early educators are leaving to become paras for $3 to $5 an hour raises, and we have some areas where the school readiness and CDC programs have really seen a depletion of staff, and we have the compensation committee sent in a data request to OEC about registry information. I hope that we can talk some more about sort of how we do sort of a task force data requests in a better way.
Jessica, may I respond to that? I mean, Beth arguably could do. I will say from the task force perspective, as one person, one of the people who were supposed to help figure that out, I've just put at the end of our document data requests so that people can put their name, their subcommittee, and what the request is, because the intent was to make sure to secure a point of contact with OEC and SDE. We have secured that with OEC. Thank you, Beth and colleagues, and are in the process of doing that with the SDE. And then also we want all the data to go in a repository because most of our subcommittees will want access to similar data or should have access to that. So to answer that most specifically, Meryl, is if you put it in, I know you already made a request. If you put it also in the document, it will come consolidated with the other requests we have in a reasonable amount of time. I am confident and have been assured.
Okay.
And as soon as we know the SDE contact, we'll do the same.
Meryl, I can move the request because you CC'd me. I can move that into the document, that if that's the request, that the full request that you're referring to, I can move that into the document that Paige is referring to. And Marcia and I will get back to the whole task force, hopefully within the next week, with a clearer process for the repository. Georgia.
I just had a quick question, and I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit, Beth. Apologies. But I know we're getting ready to do a bonus, the childcare worker bonus. Is there any plans, given that people are going to be documenting how many staff they actually have? is there any plans
Yeah.
to use that data to actually get as close as possible to a count of the
Yes.
workforce? And can we use that process to kind of track like some of the other demographic stuff have, and I know my colleagues are going to be very upset with me, but as a part of our reporting process, can we have them provide some demographics, even some basic demographics like
Yeah.
age, race,
Yes.
educational attainment and stuff, and do like a cross analysis with the background check system and the registry?
Georgia, I really appreciate that question. Part of the reason we split the workforce enhancement funding to a very simple rollout and then a more complex rollout in the spring is we are having conversations to see if there are so many resources in the registry, but but for the most part, it's the state funded programs that are required to enter staff in the registry. So many staff don't even know about the PD and resources that are available there. And we don't have good information about the rest of the workforce. We use the registry to pay state funded programs, their qualified workforce incentive directly. So the funding went direct to the provider, and that we are evaluating the complexity of something like that for the second round, because it would both help us understand at a much better level the workforce, because surveys, no matter what you try, are just incomplete. And so we're thinking about using the registry for that. We are process and payment. And we are also looking at, for the rollout of qualified workforce incentives, the round to the public, to the non-public programs and non-state funded program, and longevity bonuses across the industry can we successfully use the registry for that process, which will come before the second round. So basically, we're looking at how operationally functional can that system be to get the data. We see this as like a once in a lifetime opportunity to get really good data about the workforce, because we're offering something, which is, workforce incentives. So I'm open to your feedback and input on that. And for those of you in state funded programs, I see Karen on the line. You don't have to do it now, but give us feedback about how that worked for the qualified workforce incentives. We haven't done the longevity bonuses for the state funded yet. We haven't done any of those yet, but that came out of we sort of piloted with the state funded programs that said, you gave us bonuses for degrees, but I have some people who've been here 30 years and in this field. And we heard loud and clear that directors felt left out, and that some kind of recognition of longevity should be a part of the program. So we've factored that in with our federal funding. So that was probably too much detail here, but Georgia, the short answer is yes. We're trying to figure out how do we leverage these workforce funds to get more information about the workforce. And we don't need a long conversation here, but I'm open to meeting with you and meeting with the set of directors to give us feedback on that. Meryl, it might be something we could take feedback on an alliance call on. But there is an opportunity that can really inform this committee about where are things now for real, like where are we? So that was too long an answer.
Can I just do a quick follow-up? So is there a process in place right now that uses all of those portals, the background check portal? And I know we can't really use a background check portal, but the background check portal does collect some
Yes.
demographic information. The
Yes.
registry does collect demographic information,
Yes.
but I know I'm guilty of not filling everything out.
Mhm.
And the registry does not require you to fill everything out to proceed. And then obviously you have the stabilization portal where you are going to get some numbers. I know there's estimate that there's about 26,000 people in the in Connecticut ECE workforce, but is there a process or is there a mechanism at the OEC right now to kind of do that cross data check and analysis with the portal, or is that something that?
Not at this time, but we're so lucky to have a new IT manager who is looking at some cross-agency communication between our systems. It's a real weakness here, but it's something we hope to do. And the BCIS, though I know, it's not always the easiest thing. Other states have no way to notify directors when their people are out of compliance. And this now that we have a way that there's to notify you, it's a really good point that could be a system that could incorporate that data in a way that would get it updated regularly, because the background check system is regularly updated between directors and us. So I think I hadn't thought of that. It's a really good suggestion. Sorry about that.
All right, thank you. Dr. Marcia Bryant, should we, I'm looking at the time, it being 10:30, should we move to our presenters?
Sure. Who's first? Steve? Oh, okay. So since we're focusing on the ECE workforce, Steve Marcellinus is here. He is the Transfer and Articulation Director for the CT State System. And so he's just going to talk a little bit about what we have at higher ed and some of the options for our students to move into the profession of early childhood. And Steve prepared a presentation. Ken's going to share.
Everybody, thank you, Marcia. As Marcia mentioned, my name is Steve Marcellinus. I am the Director of Transfer and Articulation for the CSCU System Office. I really appreciate the opportunity speaking to all of you. What I plan on doing today is just talking about really transfer in general, the pipeline for our students as far as how we are admitting, hopefully retaining and getting students from one institution to the next in order for them to reach their goals, and how that's hopefully applicable to this group today. I'm going to go through my information fairly quickly and hopefully open it up for questions and see if I could assist in anything that might be, any concerns or anything that you might have at this time. So just to kind of start off, it is very encouraging to see everybody here today, different stakeholders from across the state talking and addressing these issues. This isn't something that any one organization, any one institution can address on their own and solve on their own. And that's very parallel to what I do with transfer and trying to get people together to talk about the issues, identify barriers, and see what we can do to make the process easier, again, to get students to be successful in their overall achievement of a degree or a credential in order to get them out into the workforce and moving on with their lives as they see fit. We do have to think about our students today, and it's very different than what we might have experienced going through our path. Education isn't exactly a linear thing anymore. We have students that are starting at four-year institutions, they're transferring out to a two-year institution, and they might go back to that same four-year institution that they started. They might go to a different four-year institution. A number of students are starting at our two-year community colleges and then trying to make their way to a four-year school because a bachelor's degree is simply what they need in order to be successful in the career of their choice. There are also some very large issues and concerns that I think we also all need to be aware of, and I think it's very relevant towards this group, and that's just the idea of enrollment itself. higher ed is facing, increasing drops of new students. Starting very soon, we're going to start to feel the effects in higher education for the significant drops in birth rates. You've probably all seen it working in early childhood, starting in 2007. Families just weren't as big as they used to be. People started holding off kids, especially with the Great Recession, and that is going to be catching up to us in higher education fairly soon, starting in 2025, 2026, where we simply aren't going to see the number of students starting as freshmen as we did before, because there aren't as many. Not only that, we also have the lack of faith or the questionable return on investment of a degree. A few years ago, if you talk to high school juniors and seniors, it was estimated that around 71% of them had higher ed as a goal, as their next step once they graduate. The recent survey dropped down to 51% of students are saying that they want to pursue higher education. So not only do we have less students, but less of them actually want to take that next step. And on top of all of that, what I'm sure you all have seen, and I've heard already with, the conversation of professionals changing career based on pay and all that other stuff, it's a fiercely competitive market right now. This is not the only conversation that I'm having with groups like this, as far as how do we address getting more students to the goal line, to get them out into the workforce and meet workforce demands. We're having the same conversation with elementary and secondary educators. Nursing is having similar issues. STEM all around is looking for those skilled employees that they could recruit and get into their organizations. So it's just something, again, that I think that we need to consider as a whole. This slide here is something that I wanted to share with you. I've been in my position at the system office for a few years now. We don't have a ton of data as far as transfers concerned. We are working on that, but this is something that we typically pull every year, and that's we call it "Where did they go?" This slide right here will show you a little snippet of that information. I pulled all of the ECE degrees options across the 12 community colleges, and what this is showing you here is students that were previously in the community colleges and are newly matriculated into a four-year institution. So essentially they were at the community college, but starting in fall 21, they started at a four-year school. So you can see again on the far left, the degrees that they would have been pursuing at the community colleges. There are a number of different options there because 12 community colleges, 12 different ways, codes, whatnot, as far as what the students were pursuing. And then you could see again how it's broken down. In the kind of middle of the degree of this chart, you could see students that actually received a degree or credential. Next to that, you could see the number of students that transferred without a degree. So essentially, they did not graduate from the community college, but they still moved on to a four-year institution. Paige, I see your hand up, so go ahead.
First of all, I appreciate you and this work so much, Steve. So thank you for being here today. And I just want to make sure I'm understanding this data chart. This only reflects public community colleges to public 4 years. Is that true? So pathways from that would involve any privates are not reflected?
So all of the independent schools, with the exception of UConn, which is designated in its own area, all of the independent schools are classified in the other category.
Thank you.
Yeah. Georgia.
Hi, Steve. Is it possible to zoom in? It's a little bit difficult.
That would be Ken, I believe.
Oh, Ken? Yeah.
And I could definitely share this with you.
And so are we saying in total in the fall of 2021, a total of 31 students transferred into the four-year college? I'm confused.
Yep. So from the community colleges to four-year institutions, 31 students started from, again, these degrees. Now, this does not indicate that these are the only students that are pursuing ECE at the four-year institution. That's one of the things that I'll talk about as well, because a lot of students who do not plan on completing a degree, they might pursue something like general studies or liberal arts and sciences just because they're looking to take maybe a few gen ed courses and then transfer out to pursue another program at a four-year institution. So this is not inclusive to all students that are pursuing ECE at a four-year institution. It is simply the ones that started with ECE in mind that we could identify as an end goal.
So do we have a sense, though, that most folks who are entering into the ECE career path, into the ECE career, are primarily entering at the two-year colleges first and then to the four-year college? And then can we extrapolate that based on these numbers, that the numbers where a student enter directly into a four-year college may be less than this?
That is something that we would have to work on, and that's something we would have to work with our four-year partners. Right now I could pull data tracking students from kind of where they are within their path. I do not have follow-through data of what happens once they get to that four-year institution and follow through. And I would have to go directly to the 4 years to ask how many students are starting in the ECE programs, and then start to compare and contrast as far as who's starting at the 2-year, who's starting at the 4-year. For that, we don't have a direct comparison for that at this time. Does that address what you were asking?
It does, and it would be interesting to me, and I don't want to monopolize a conversation, to find out how does this compare to students who are pursuing elementary ed, an elementary ed degree.
Absolutely, and that's also you're hitting all my next slides. So I appreciate the questions. You're hitting the right ones, because that is something that, again, at the 2-year institutions, something that we have to be cognizant of, and things that we need to I think need to be a little bit more intentional with. Meryl?
So my understanding is that there's been a pretty precipitous drop in students enrolling in the community college early childhood programs. But I've also heard that there's been an uptick at Charter Oak in their associates program. So I just wanted to see if there's a way we could get a better picture of that. We've had a lot of people leave the field, leaving from early childhood, going into public schools as paras, which means we're going to have a lot of new people starting off just with getting their basic credentials of a CDA and 12 credits, and then hopefully moving up towards the associate's degree. But I think many people had sort of not really seen Charter Oak as a place where people were getting associate's degrees, because that wasn't what they originally were set out to do. But that is something that's happening now. So I'm just want to make sure we have that full picture.
Absolutely. So I think that's something that, again, I think for the 4-year institutions, that might be a request for them to say, what are your enrollments for these particular programs? And that's the 4-year and the 2-year, which they should all be able to provide you that information. You do point out, though, a really good point as far as with Charter Oak. And again, if you could look at this chart, you could see a number of students are transferring out before they receive an associate degree to Charter Oak. And that's something that I think, again, to me, this speaks to, okay, why are students doing that? Are they doing that because of the online option is just more feasible for them? Is that something that they're seeking out? Again, I don't have that information. This isn't anything that we really dove into. We're just starting out to get some of this basic information for us. But when I was looking at this chart, when I put it together for this slide deck, that was something that stuck out to me. Was, why is this happening? You have to understand that, when students are transferring out of the community colleges at this point, they might be doing so without taking full advantage of PACT and taking advantage of that free tuition for their associate degree. Again, just things to think about and consider as you move forward with your work. But again, just information that I wanted to share. And the other reason why I wanted to share this is because you could see it's only a fraction of students that are actually receiving the associate degree. Usually when we talk about pipelines and retention and all that fun stuff, we usually talk about articulation agreements that are dependent upon the completion of an associate degree. Most of our students, and it's around 60, it's over 60%, typically transfer without an associate degree. So if we move forward with that mindset, we're doing so without really addressing the issue. And that is that, again, most students are not transferring with the complete degree. So would an articulation degree contingent upon that make the most sense? So again, just something to kind of think about and consider. Ken, if you could go to the next slide. So I'm hoping that this is just information that is being repeated, and it's not new, but as you all might be aware, starting in fall 23, we will no longer have 12 independent community colleges. There will be one single Connecticut State Community College. With that, there is one academic catalog, and there are specific aligned courses that will be moving forward within that catalog. What that means is any four-year institution that had an articulation agreement or a pipeline from ECE to ECE at their institution, they're going to have to go back to the drawing board with CT State to make sure that those courses that they've worked that out with are moving forward for the one college. This is work that all institutions are going to have to do. We're trying to organize that for our regional public 4 years and Charter Oak, and we will be having conversations with independent schools as well as how to do this. But business as usual is going to change in fall 23. And again, everybody has to be aware of that. With that, though, there are also opportunities that are coming out of this, and that is with ECE, they are moving forward with an ECE transfer track that not all 12 institutions had previously. So having that available statewide is something that, again, is new. I feel it is an opportunity for our students, but it is something that is a change. Another change at CT State is they are moving towards what's considered a guided pathways model. I'm not going to go into the details of that, but essentially it's very academic and career plan based. They've gone through the process of hiring hundreds of, I think 100 around of what they call guided pathway advisors to reduce the student to advisor ratio down to a 250 to 1. That is a significant change from what they had previously. I also bring this up because coming from my previous position as a transfer advisor at Southern Connecticut State University, I also know that education programs are one of the most difficult programs to advise in. They're a little complicated. There is very little room for error. And when a student does not start off with a clean slate of classes, it can be very difficult to navigate and get them through a program. Having the guided pathway advisors in on any conversations that you have as far as opportunities available to get a student from point A to point B would be very, very helpful. They're typically their first point of contact, and they are a resource that I know that CT State will be leaning on more and more as time goes on and as they develop their role within that institution. Next slide, Ken. And then I mentioned before that, the early childhood education faculty did move forward with an aligned transfer track for an associate degree. This is very intentional in their design to address the general education requirements that are specific towards moving forward for a bachelor's degree, and the program requirements as well. Again, it's based off of the completion of a degree and how those courses transfer over. I do feel that we need to have continued conversations with both CT State and the four-year institutions to not only say that it's with the completion of a degree, but to lock in course for course articulations to guarantee whether a student completes a degree or just simply takes a course at CT State and wants to transfer that back to their institution, that they could do so, receive credit, and move on. This idea of, stumbling upon retaking courses or not quite meeting expectations, that's something that, again, we have to continue to have conversations with to try to allow students the most return on their investment and get them through these degrees in an effective way. The other nice thing about this is it allows us to identify students very early in the process as far as their intentions of why they're at CT State. It was mentioned before as far as, how do we know where these students are going or what they will be doing. If they are pursuing an ECE transfer track, it's hopefully very apparent that that's what they want to do as far as a career goes. If not, we could identify and get them into an appropriate degree and or verify that this is the appropriate degree and the career that they want to pursue. It also allows, and this is something that I would strongly encourage, and this is something that we're working with elementary and secondary education as well. It allows the four-year institutions, those four-year partners, to engage with those students earlier than later. And this is very important because there's actually a thing out there called transfer shock. And that is when a student is at a two-year institution that might be the size of their high school. And then they go to a four-year institution and the parking garage is as large as the institution that they just came from. The idea of moving around from building to building, trying to find the different resources they need, whether it's advising, writing support, basic needs such as a food bank or something along those lines, that is different for them and something they have to acclimate towards. This is something where the four-year institutions can help with that transition. And again, it's not unique to ECE, but it is an opportunity that this group could definitely look at and address as far as how do we make that transition a whole lot easier. I'm going to give Dean Hedges credit for this one, and that's one of in another meeting that we were both attending. He brought up the idea of even just the application process. How do we make that more seamless for students instead of having to reapply to another program, transition all their academic records from one area to the next? How do we make that easier? How can we facilitate for them since we already have that information? It's the same stuff that we're looking for at the four-year institutions. How do we identify some of those barriers, eliminate that, make it easier for the students? And that way, going back to, again, the guided pathway advisors and faculty and staff working with these students, they are under a lot of pressure to not just advise a student on what courses they need to take moving forward. They are addressing mental health issues, financial barriers, food insecurity. If they could get to the conversation of why do you even want to do this in the first place, they're lucky. And if they get to see those students again, they're lucky. So I guess the best advice I could give to this group moving forward is whatever you do, try to simplify the process for the students, for the faculty and staff working with those students, so we don't have a person on campus that could guide them through it, that anybody would be able to help and facilitate that conversation and get that student to completion. So I think my next slide is just a big question mark. So if there are any questions or anything that I could address, I'd be glad to do it.
Just in the spirit of data, we're hoping to see at some point, I think, a comparison to elementary, also a comparison to early childhood, because lest we forget the early childhood certifications for the state are integrated up through kindergarten, and this is a birth to sixth space. So I made a note that wherever we're keeping those notes, I think that would be helpful too.
Let me comment just for elementary, it is extremely difficult to track students from CT State to the four-year institutions because there are very limited options or degrees. There is a pathway to education degree that is offered at it's not widely advertised. But other than that, most students go into liberal arts and sciences or general studies. Some of them enter early childhood, but are usually advised out of it if they're looking to pursue elementary or secondary, because it's not really the best path for them.
So Steve, I know I I just want to clarify that I just want to clarify that the data that you are sharing with us are those students that have either are still pursuing a degree and or have achieved a degree. Is that correct or no? Or
The data shows students who are at CT State and have transitioned or matriculated to a four-year institution. Whether or not they're pursuing ECE at that four-year institution, I do not know. I do not have that follow-up information. So that is the only thing I could tell you, is that, you know, they might be ECE, they could be going into social work at Southern. You know, at some of those, there's one student who went to Central. Central has a early childhood mental health concentration. It does not have early childhood education. So I don't even know how those degrees are associated with each other. So those are, again, there's no guarantee that a student is pursuing ECE as their next step, but that's what I could tell you, is that at one point they were, and now they're at another institution.
so those potential 31 students, you may not get that full 31 students that even come out with into the ECU workforce.
Even with that, those potential 31 students, if they do not have that, you know, 2.7 GPA that are applicable to even apply for an ECE program, or did not take the appropriate prerequisite courses that weren't specified in the associate degree but are required to apply to an ECE program, they might hit a stumbling block where they have to take a semester just to kind of catch up and get in. This is where, again, that engagement in trying to break down those barriers to try to simplify the process is so important. And again, I'm biased towards Southern, because when I started there and I talked to you know, the great Helen Marks, and she told me about, you know, this is how you get into an education program at Southern, and she pulled out a full sheet with text everywhere and arrows and gate points and all this other stuff. And I brought it to Gateway when I was advising, and I was like, this doesn't work. This doesn't speak their language. They don't have the courses that are listed here. And luckily it was through work with Dean Hedges, Jessica, Dr. Marks, Adam Goldberg, that we were able to identify some of those barriers and start to simplify the process. And that made my job a whole lot easier to say, not only can you pursue education at Southern, but you could also do this, this, and this, which we simply did not have the time to talk about before. So those are the things that, again, you look at these programs, and unfortunately there are it's a lot to pack into a 120 credit box. So the easier we can make it for everybody, I think the more success you'd seeing students get from point A to point B. I think it was Commissioner Bai and then Dean Hedges.
I think Dean Hedges first, just because you're talking from a Southern perspective. Dean, why don't you go ahead, just because it may add context for my question.
Okay, thank you, Beth. So I think, first of all, thank you, Steve, for being here. Yeah, and the work has expanded greatly. We've got still a lot of work to do in this space of transfer, and I think that's certainly something in my college I put a priority on, and we, you know, in many ways, in trying to ensure that those pathways are as smooth as possible, but also engaging with our community of educators prior to them even coming here, for the reasons you've given. And so there's much work to be done. I wanted to just a couple of points for the task force. Each EPP, educator preparation provider, is required to submit a report each year to the US Department of Education. It's our Title II report. And in that report, there is a list of completers, degree completers in each of the academic majors. Those reports are also submitted to the State Department of Ed, and they are collated and put into a dashboard. We're always a year behind because of how our reporting to the department is. And they're working on updating their dashboard there. But you should be able to find, we are required to make those public as well. And that is a source of data, and we can collate that data as well. We do have to report out within the aggregate, though, program completers, gender, race, and ethnicity within the report. So that's a point where we can certainly pull and share that data. I'm just looking at ours now, and within early childhood, in the 2021, there were 30 program completers. And I mentioned that because I don't know if anyone else thought when they looked at the chart that Steve produced, the numbers are really low. And I think we just need to put a spotlight on that in terms of what are our shortage needs? What are our recommendations? Where do we want this to go in sort of in an action plan way? So that was one comment. And secondly, on the other side of the barriers, deans are also allowed to waiver GPAs when students are entering into the programs. And so the 2.7, whilst that's set in the regulations, there's also a waiver process that is within each institution. And I make that decision after this, depending based on support and an application for that as well. So I just want to be clear that because sometimes higher ed's pointed at as the barrier, and I want to assure the people on the task force that we're doing a lot to try and address the barriers that have been maybe established or just assumed over decades. That's it. Over to you, Commissioner.
I just was going to make a broad point about, I know when I worked at St. Joe's, we really, when they shifted from pre-K to 3 and 1 to 6 to K to 6, we just lost all the majors. It was already bad enough that the education faculty were counseling the kids out of early childhood. Then that change came. And I think it's important for this committee to sort of take a stance on that as well. And I'm working with Paige and others and Karen Lott in a subgroup around this issue, but I just wanted to raise that up. And just, Steve, thanks for that presentation. We have some campaigns to try to push into the pipeline right now. And we're spending significant dollars, both to support the lab schools, to advertise that this is a great career, to fund workforce pipeline programs. And then we have another $6 million to fund workforce pipeline programs. So how do we have a conversation with faculty or somewhere with the CSCU system and the privates about counseling students out of early childhood ed? Because if we're pushing all this effort into sending students into early childhood, and then they get there and they're told, well, you'll make more money in public school. This whole return on investment in education, it's anathema to me. I don't like it. I think there's education for education. And I also think early childhood should pay a living wage. So I understand it, but I can't imagine if I'd been counseled out of early childhood and child development as a student, I'd probably be teaching in a public school still today. But I was lucky. I had a university that said, this is a great career. And I had a work-study job in a program that was fabulous. And the whole culture at the University of New Hampshire was that early childhood ed is a fabulous career. And I'm afraid, I don't know what this committee can do, or if it just facilitated a conversation with education and early childhood faculty at colleges to say, we're sending you a bunch of people I mean, I believe that these programs will connect more people with the community colleges. But that point of transfer and articulation, if they get counseled out of early childhood into elementary, you know, we're just going to be in the same place in 6 or 7 years, instead of feeling like these marketing lab school investments and pipeline investments are making any difference. So I'm just making a plea to how can we have some impact on the higher ed institutions and how students are counseled. Or maybe we can't. Maybe you're going to say to me, we can't.
Well, and let me clarify, and it's a great point. You know, really what it comes down to is it's not really being counseled out of early childhood. It's students being put into the wrong major to begin with. There are a lot of students who are pursuing elementary, and because they see education, they pick that major, not knowing that's really not for that. But I think
Right.
what you're saying is that, and you know, again, everyone has kind of their bias, and it's based off of the information that's relevant to them. So getting in front of some of these guided pathway advisors to give them the information of the opportunities that are
Yes.
available, because again, ECE, there aren't a ton of resources, and Marcia could probably speak to this more. There might be a faculty member or two. That's not enough. That's not enough time in front of students. They cannot, you know,
Right.
recruit, retain, and teach all their classes at the same time. So it's getting those, again, GPAs involved in some of these conversations, because they are the ones that will be working a lot with students their first few years. There is a new course available at CT State, CCS 1001, where they're going to be talking about careers and career planning. I mean, there are opportunities, but again, I think it starts with what are the perceptions of some of the folks that are talking to these students, and why might they say, well,
Yes.
do this or do that? But the opportunity now is far greater than it was before, because again, the students will have kind of an assigned advisor they'll be talking to, and those advisors also have kind of specializations, areas that they will, academic areas that they're going to be looking into. But that doesn't mean that, again, the health and human performance or allied health and nursing advisor shouldn't know about ECE, because maybe a student who tried for nursing, not knowing whether nursing was going to be the right fit for them, maybe now they're looking for a plan B because they couldn't get into a nursing program. So these are all things to, again, consider, but it starts with information and communication. And that's why I started this whole thing with, it's very encouraging to see you all coming together. I hope that there's a recommendation to keep a council like this going, so we address these barriers or these issues, whatever it is, as they come up, rather than reacting to, because now there's just the bucket's full and we have to get to all of them at once. But I think that's what I found, especially we're doing this work with, again, secondary and elementary education, and we're having very similar conversations, but a lot of it starts off with communication and getting the right information to the right people.
Yeah, and there might be lessons this committee can learn from what they're doing in elementary and secondary ed for recruitment. And I'm not saying that it's purposeful. I'm just saying from my experience at St. Joe's, it happened quite a bit that students were counseled out of early childhood. And from what I understand, it's still happening in general. So your point about getting to the counselors is a really good one.
I just have this 1 second follow-up to emphasize that point, and to remind us that one of the ways, even in my own institution, is people will be interested in special education and people don't point them to early childhood. And I think one of the pieces that we want to make sure we're highlighting as part of our work in the birth to 6 space is the early intervention work. The national level work around early childhood and the Council for Exceptional Children. And those conversations are powerful. And Connecticut has done amazing work at the community college level to revise and rework syllabi so that they are actively and current and inclusive. And that's a real pride point, I think, for our state. And as coming from UHeart and a four-year institution that has embraced that fully, it's important for pathway, but it's also just important for the work and the choices that people are making. So thank you for the counselor piece also, Steve. That's really helpful.
I don't want to belabor the point, and I see that Mary is here, and so I want to be respectful of her time. But the other piece that I think that we need to think about is just not in addition to the folks that are being counseled out of early childhood education, but is there a way for us to start to track the folks who are not successfully navigating the system and are dropping out? Either dropping out because they're first generation college students that do not have that outside community support to help them through the process, and or who are having financial difficulties with getting through the process. And I share that because with Circle, our organization started some 7 years ago with our apprenticeship program. We were anticipating attracting people who were new to the ECE field, who always wanted to work with children, but didn't have a pathway in. We were very shocked to find, even to this day, that the folks that we are pulling into our apprenticeship programs, majority of them have tried and failed at pursuing ECE at the community college level. And so we were their alternative pathway to pursue a career that they wanted. And so I think we need to start to as well look at what are those systems of support that's being built in. And I know, Steve, you mentioned that there isn't enough in the first place to catch those students who are first generation, do not have that familial support, and how do we help them to navigate the system. And I do want to also point out, in defense of the counselors, because I worked many years ago for LEAP, and a part of what we did was to create a college support arm of LEAP, where we work with our young people that are coming in as junior and junior counselors to help them to figure out what college to go to. And I know that a part of our charge was to help them to think about, especially for those people of color and who have had a generational history of poverty. Part of our job was to counsel them into thinking about what is that career pathway that is going to change the trajectory of your life and your family's life. And I can understand from the perspective of that advisor, understanding the finances around early childhood education, it would be very difficult to ask that advisor to counsel a young person to pursue a career path that will ensure that they only make $20,000 a year, regardless of the degree attainment and how long they have done this work. And so I do want to lift that issue up as well, and to say, until we address the compensation issue, we are putting every single person in an impossible situation, both the students, the universities, the counselors, the early childhood education profession. Just all of us are in an impossible situation. Now, until we address compensation, we're going to be here spinning the wheel, having the same conversations over and over and over again. If I could make a good living as an early childhood education provider, there would be no need for us to have this conversation about how to pull people in. There really wouldn't be. This is the fundamental issue with early child education. And I do want to disclose that I started off as an elementary school teacher, and I found my love and my passion in early childhood education. So there are people making those choices every single day, but they're making it at a personal expense to themselves and to their families. And it's about time we stop asking people to make those types of sacrifices to work in an industry that supports every other industry in Connecticut.
Jessica, Marsha, and my hand raised, may I?
Go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah, and I'll be brief because I know we have another speaker, but I thank you, Georgia, for that. I agree, compensations at that really is at the heart of it. I would also want us to put together recommendations that also cover the complexity of how that underpins things, but the issues that we're raising now. A couple of things. Counselors, our students are getting counseled in lots of different ways. And I just want to raise the issue that the counseling in or counseling out, there's counseling at schools, there's counseling at universities, counseling at community colleges, counseling outside of that, public perception of what a good career is or not. I mean, we've got school counselors saying not to go into teaching, let alone early childhood. So I think we need to sort of think carefully about the different types of counseling or advising, career advising or other, and the multiple, the different ways that is out there and can be extremely confusing for someone, particularly first generation, who's seeking clarity and wants to pursue their passion as well at the end of the day. The average age of an undergrad here at Southern is about 25 and a half. So it's a shifting demographic, even in terms of how we're not always, it's not just students coming straight from high school, let alone our graduate population. And coupled with a lot of the things Steve brought up, please keep in mind, and this is something I have been trying to bring up and advocate for as long as I've been in Connecticut, is our outdated teacher preparation regulations. And those regulations are a huge barrier to some of the issues that we're facing in having a modern curriculum for our students, alternative pathways or otherwise. And that's something that has to be, it's not new to any commissioner, this news, but there are things there that really can become almost an artificial burden when you're trying to cover the things that are necessary, and then working with the transfer students on things they may have taken which don't count or otherwise. And Steve Marcellinus knows very much what I'm talking about, as does the faculty on this call. So we need to put a very strong recommendation there for those to be updated and changed. And finally, where does kindergarten lie in all of this? And the shift of that, and where it's been in terms of, is it elementary, is it early childhood, and how do students make a choice who want to pursue that particular age group? Particularly now, it's back, there's discussion about where are we. I'm not disagreeing with, but where does it lie within the certification, the licensure space as well? That's it.
Okay, thank you so much, Steve, for coming today and sharing this information. If there are any other questions in the group that come up for you regarding Steve's presentation or other data requests, you could drop them in the chat, or you could reach out to Marcia and I, and we can follow up with that, because we are now going to turn to Mary Harrell from NAEYC, who has come today to talk a little bit about the national landscape of early childhood education. And 11:15, so I'm going to turn it over to you, Mary. She is the Senior Director of Higher Education with the National Association for the Education of Young Children. So thank you so much for being here today, Mary.
Thank you for having me. And I feel like saying amen, amen, amen. I came into this conversation, and this has very much been the conversation at NAEYC and across the country. And I really appreciate all the comments that I heard, and a particular thank you to Georgia for summarizing. At the heart of the matter is compensation. And if we had compensation, we would not be having to have all these conversations. But in the absence of us achieving the compensation that we want for our profession, it is important for us to look at the systems and supports we have in place and to see what we can do to make it as simple as process as possible to becoming an early childhood educator, thinking about our pathways and the supports, so that the burden of the cost of becoming an early childhood educator doesn't lie on the early childhood educator, but is borne by the system. And just thinking about what we can put in place. I'll share my screen in a minute. I've got some slides, but I was asked to come in, talk a little bit about the national landscape of the early childhood workforce, and to talk about the unifying framework, some branding behind me related to that, and the work that all of us here and across the country have been doing to come to consensus about priorities for the profession and how we can make this a profession that is well prepared, it's diverse, it is effective, and that it's well compensated, and how we can bring all early childhood educators who want to be part of this into that model. And to talk a little bit about higher education, and particularly doing a little bit of a deep dive in that, just with the hat that I wear at NAEYC. I want to say thank you and just acknowledge Connecticut as truly a state that is leading in all of this work, and thinking about how we invest in quality for young children, for higher education, and just thinking about the pathways we can create for early childhood educators. So it's really a privilege to be able to spend some time with you today. So let me share my screen here and see. All right. Okay. We'll see. There we go. So I thought, we will start the reality that all of us are living in right now as we think about the impact that COVID has had on childcare, on our early childhood education workforce, our profession. We know even prior to the pandemic, we were facing these challenges, but they were certainly exacerbated beginning in March of 2020, and seeing just a staffing crisis that we are facing across the country in every state. That when we face these kind of crises, typically policymakers, the answer is to deregulate the profession. But we know in doing that, that is actually harming children, as well as our early childhood educators. And particularly when we face these staffing crises, we want to raise ratios, and that really does impact the health and safety of children, and the well-being of our early childhood educators. And we've seen a widening of the gap between, in our field, early childhood education, birth through age 8, but really exacerbating the gap between birth and 5 and K3. We've seen, as probably many of you know, NAEYC has been surveying the field throughout the pandemic to understand the impact on programs, on educators, on budget, on staffing. We have another survey that is out to the field right now. So hopefully you may have seen this in your inboxes, as we really encourage you to share this with programs in Connecticut and early childhood educators. Just a few from our survey that we did about a little over a year ago today, just in terms of where programs were in relation to the impact of the pandemic, that almost every program is experiencing the shortages, that wages remained the key issue, and why educators were leaving and why they were not able to recruit. Particularly concerning too is that almost a third of the educators, and I think there were over 5,000 that responded to this, indicated that they were considering leaving their programs. And I think we are seeing that today just with the exacerbated staffing crisis that all of us are facing right now. And given the higher ed hat I wear, I also want to talk about that parallel to this crisis we're facing in childcare, in our childcare programs, we are also seeing this play out in our early childhood higher education programs. We surveyed across the country. We had about 400 institutions of higher education with a pretty even split of community colleges and baccalaureate programs responding to this, and seeing a corresponding drop in enrollment in our early childhood education degree programs, which of course correlates then with the reduction in the number of students who are graduating from our early childhood education programs. About a third of our degree programs have faced budget cuts, which includes cuts to faculty. And many of us know often in our early childhood programs, there may just be one full-time faculty member within those programs. So it really has had a significant impact on staffing in higher education as well. And that many of the faculty, just as our early childhood educators have been experiencing housing and economic employment insecurity, food insecurity during this time, a fifth of faculty reported that they are also experiencing this as well. And just as we saw that, that almost a third of childcare workers indicated that they may be leaving the field in the next few years, a quarter of our faculty also indicated that they plan to switch careers or retire in the next 3 years. And so we're seeing an exodus from our degree programs as well. So I just want to emphasize, and I so appreciate the investments that Connecticut is making in the higher education programs right now, because this is our higher ed programs were vulnerable. They were vulnerable before the pandemic, because we are preparing that while this is a high skill profession, it is a low wage career, and that is a really challenging case to make to presidents and provosts and chancellors to keep their programs. And so I appreciate that the investments that Connecticut is making in faculty and the programs themselves, as that will make a difference in the viability of our programs, our preparation pipeline to continue. We've also seen, it is really alarming to see the crisis that it's unfolding for the field, but we have also seen a lot of opportunities during this time too, with the unprecedented federal investment in early childhood education. And I know Connecticut is making the absolute most of all of the federal dollars that have been coming in to the states to really invest that back into the profession, invest that back into higher education. And we've seen, related to this, that childcare programs have been incredibly creative during this time and resourceful during this time so that they can stay open and keep as many classrooms open as they possibly can. We've seen, because of, again, of federal funding, opportunities for, even if they're temporary, some bumps in compensation, but that has made a really significant difference for early childhood educators. Making those investments really matters. And so we have done surveying around the paycheck protection funds. We're surveying right now to better understand how other federal dollars have been used for programs, but that really has, that 60% of educators saw increases in compensation because of those relief dollars. And that was a decision point for them to stay in the profession during this time, even though they know that this is likely a temporary bump for them. We've also seen for higher education, while it's been challenging, we have seen some silver linings for higher education during this time too. And that having to be, forced to be fully online, particularly during the first year and a half of the pandemic, has in some ways, while it was a barrier to students, it was in other ways a way to increase access for early childhood educators. And because they could take these courses online at times that worked for them, they were able to participate in post-secondary education and move forward in either working on their credential or gaining their credential. And so, being online, it's sort of this two-edged sword for students in terms of being a barrier as well as a way to increase accessibility. A lot of programs reported higher engagement with students during this time because they've had the virtual office hours. And there was something about that students felt more comfortable with. And so many faculty have reported that they're really trying to maintain those opportunities through virtual office hours so that they can continue to help students, help them feel more comfortable approaching faculty, which we know when there is higher faculty engagement with students, that also is a really great retention strategy and helping students have the confidence that they can move through these programs and be successful in these programs. And we saw a lot of creativity in terms of the content in early childhood programs. For many programs, they were teaching bricks and mortar or a hybrid with some content online. Having to shift fully online really challenged faculty, but also I think had a lot of really good, was also a really good way to help move some of that coursework online and that they can continue with that. We are a clinical profession. I think there's something to be said for always being able to have those interactions with students and faculty. And of course, our students need those opportunities to work with young children. And that was, I think, probably the most challenging part, is that field experiences often just were not available during the pandemic, but that is slowly changing as programs are in person and are opening up their programs to having students again in those programs. And so, we're in the midst of this pandemic still, and we are facing these crises. We have seen some opportunities, and we have been continuing to use the unifying framework, which came out right before the pandemic, like 3 days before, and which represented a few years of work across 15 national organizations in our entire field to come to consensus about how we define our profession. It's because we recognize that if we cannot define our profession and be consistent with who we are, what it is we do, what our expectations are, it is really hard to make that case for compensation and to say, and to be able to demonstrate that we are a profession that requires specific knowledge and skills, that requires extensive professional preparation in order to effectively work with young children. And so we created the unifying framework, and we have been using this since the pandemic to really help the work at NAEYC and with the states that we partner with to think about how do we rebuild our systems in this vision for what our profession could look like. And so ultimately, and I'll walk through just some high-level recommendations from the unifying framework, but ultimately, where we're going with our vision for the profession is that each and every child is supported by early childhood educators who bring credentials and degrees with them that recognizes that they have been professionally prepared to be early childhood educators. We want to move toward a system where early childhood educators are no longer paid based on where they work or the age of children with which they work, but we want them to have a thriving wage regardless of where they work. We want to make sure that early childhood educators have access to professional preparation. We know there are so many barriers right now to early childhood educators either being able to access professional preparation or to be able to move through and continue on in their professional preparation. We had, as we did this work together, as organizations and as the fields, we recognized that there were some commitments that we needed to make to ourselves and to early childhood educators as we moved through this process. These are not all of them, but I just wanted to highlight, and particularly, and I think Connecticut is really reflecting this commitment, reflecting these commitments. But we know in moving toward, if the vision is to move toward a profession in which every early childhood educator has professional preparation, that we cannot raise the expectations for this workforce without making sure that the supports are in place for them. It is not fair, and I heard as these conversations that you all were having before I hopped on, but to ask individuals working for minimum wage and such low wages to then finance their own education and training and professional development, that is unfair, it is untenable. And so we have to be cognizant that as we think about building a profession, asking educators to be professionally prepared, that we have to make sure we have supports in place for them. And we have to be really attentive to how this can impact our communities, which have been particularly underserved. And so we have done a lot of work to really think about and to talk with educators. And there's a publication here that you've seen that is on this slide, but to really better understand, particularly for educators of color, as we talk about moving to expectations for a license to practice, moving to an expectation that you have an associate degree or an early childhood baccalaureate degree, to really understand what is needed in terms of the supports and in place for that. And we have to be cognizant of the timelines, that we cannot ask our educators to do this in a year or 2 years, but we have to be respectful of the timelines that it will take to really get to the place that we want to be as an early childhood education profession. So I want to do just a high level overview of the recommendations in the unified framework. Again, as you think about the work that you were doing on this task force and the pathways and policies you're thinking about putting in place in Connecticut, to just think about how this can support or work with what you are trying to do in the state as well. And I'll do a little bit on higher education. But as we think about the within the unifying framework, we really wanted to hone in on the early childhood educator. And we know within the field of early childhood itself, there are so many occupations and individuals who are working to support young children, help in their development, help in their education. But we really wanted to hone in on the early childhood educator themselves. And these are the individuals that are responsible for the care and learning of young children, that they are meeting the guidelines of the profession. And I'll talk in a minute about what those are. And that these are individuals who are working across all settings. And so as we think about pre-K programs, infant toddler programs, Head Start, early elementary grades, that these are individuals working across all of those settings. And as a profession, as we know in other professions, we are really centered on a core set of standards and competencies for what early childhood educators need to know and be able to do. And so when we released the unifying framework, we also released the professional standards and competencies for early childhood educators. And these were designated by the unifying framework as the core generalist competencies for early childhood educators. And the idea is that professional preparation programs, that the practitioner licensing systems in early childhood education, that employers, early childhood education employers, would use these professional standards and competencies to really guide their work. And so, for example, for employers, they might use the standards and competencies to think about their their performance evaluations of staff, and how are their staff meeting the expectations in the professional standards and competencies. We use them in our own higher education accreditation system, which I'll talk about. But our expectation is that professional preparation programs that are accredited by NAEYC, they're able to demonstrate that their curriculum is aligned to those professional standards and competencies, so that any individual graduating from those programs is prepared in those 4 competencies and is ready to effectively work with young children and their families. Probably, I think one of the biggest areas of the unifying framework is really thinking about building the pathway for early childhood educators and moving to a place where every early childhood educator is licensed to practice. And so when we look across other professions, it's a common expectation as a practitioner in those professions that you are licensed to practice. And so through the unifying framework, it's proposing a really simplified way to think about the licensure structure in states. This is sort of the model for it. We recognize that as states think about this and move into it, that it may not look exactly like this as states try to work toward this. But the notion is that within our profession, we have 3 designations of early childhood educators. And so you'll see the ECE 1, 2, and 3 designations here. And within each of those designations, each one has a really specific scope of practice. And so that ECE 1 is sort of the early entry into the profession. And it is someone who is playing a support role in the classroom. They don't have the lead educator or lead teacher responsibilities, but they are supporting the practice within that classroom. And they do have professional preparation, but it's not a degree, an associate degree or baccalaureate degree, but it might be something that is an early entry credential, like the CDA or an early entry credential that many states have as well. At the ECE 2, we move into a scope of practice where that person, because of their preparation, having an early childhood associate degree, that individual is prepared to serve as a lead educator in a birth through 5 setting, We know generally in early childhood associate degree programs that while they will have a focus on birth through age 8, the primary focus, the deep dive, really goes into birth through 5, and that's the focus of the programs. And so because of that preparation, they are able to serve as a lead educator or a teacher of record in that role, but they are not prepared to serve in that lead role in a K-3 setting. So again, they may play a support role in the practice in that classroom, but not a lead role. And at the ECE3 designation, that's someone that has an early childhood baccalaureate degree or initial master's degree. And because of the preparation, the opportunity for the field experiences in that program, that individual can serve in a lead role across birth through age 8 settings. All 3 of these designations in the professional preparation, they've had the preparation has been focused on the professional standards and competencies. So again, it's centered around that core set of competencies. Within the professional standards and competencies document itself, we have leveled what it might look like at the ECE 1, 2, and 3 in terms of the competencies that those individuals might have. And so that can be a guide for professional preparation programs as they think about their curriculum. I will say this is a first iteration of that. We have not done that in our field per se, to really think about what does competency look like at sort of the ECE 1, 2, and 3, and trying to piece out or parse out what that might look like was a really challenging conversation, I'll say, we had a group of ECE 1, 2, and 3 educators and professional preparation programs come together to really think about what is it that we teach at the associate degree level in relation to standard 2. What does that look like at the baccalaureate level? And what are the differences or commonalities right now? And there's a lot of variation across within degree levels and across degree levels. And so I suspect, and I'm pretty confident, that leveling will evolve over time as we evolve as a field. But it's a resource that we can use as a starting place right now, though, as we try to think about expectations of each of those designations. There's also within the unified framework, it lays out responsibilities for the early childhood educator, for professional preparation programs, for employers. And so I won't run through all of these, but the notion is that every part of our profession or the supports around that profession has responsibilities that we have to fulfill. Attached to each of those responsibilities, though, you'll see throughout the framework, though, is that public funding is needed for our employers or for early childhood educators or for higher ed to be able to meet those responsibilities. So that's just a piece I want to point out, that as we look at recommendations related to these, there's also a real recognition that supports need to be in place to help all of our different stakeholders get to or meet those responsibilities. There's also a focus within the framework to and acknowledging family child care providers and just recognizing the uniqueness in some ways of this part of our profession and their needs, but also making sure that as we build out this profession, as we think about implementation of these recommendations, that we are really attentive to the structure of family child care providers and making sure that they are included in the work that we are doing to build out the profession. Oh, and I skipped over. One of the other pieces too within the unifying framework is that we recognize there's a role for states. There's a role for the federal government in this and right-sizing that role, where in many states, they've had an outsized role in sort of setting the guidelines for the profession. And the intention within the unifying framework is that the structure for the profession, the guidelines for the profession, they really need to come from the profession, the early childhood educators, higher ed, and setting those. And so really it's trying to shifting the roles, right-sizing the roles is what we call it in the unifying framework for how the profession, the states, and the federal government partner together to support early childhood educators. And of course, it's all centered around compensation, and that this is building toward how we make that case for compensation. Again, with the one of the number one notion being that we really want compensation to be comparable to for all early childhood educators and does not rest on who you work for, the setting that you work for, the age group of children that you work for, and that it really is a thriving wage, not just a living wage, but a thriving wage for early childhood educators. And that compensation, it's salary and it's the benefits. And so as we think about healthcare, retirement, vacation pay, thinking about access to substitute pools, et cetera, that we're really trying to think broadly about what compensation should look like for early childhood educators. And that compensation increases as our experience and competency increases for early childhood educators, because we know that's not the case right now. We wanted to, think about, as we think about what a thriving wage might look like, that at least as a first step, aligning to public school salary scales, it could be a first step for this, but it doesn't need to be the ceiling, but that's the floor of what we're looking for, to at least parity with our K-12 colleagues. But again, that should not be the stopping place for our profession. I want to say a little bit just about higher education, because the unifying framework really does center early childhood higher ed programs as the pipeline for the early childhood education workforce. And so if we want a thriving and healthy workforce, we also have to have a thriving and healthy early childhood higher education pipeline for our profession. And so the recommendations in the unifying framework, they name specific responsibilities for professional preparation programs, and you'll see those in the blue circles here. So this expectation that our curriculum will be aligned to the professional standards and competencies. As we think about making that shift to make sure that while higher ed programs will never look exactly the same across the country, and nor should they, we can at least all be centered on the same standards to help build some cohesiveness within degree programs and across degree programs as well. We have a really big responsibility, although it's not our responsibility alone, but to contribute to building those seamless pathways. And so I think when I came on, I heard some conversation about, there's just such frustration that when the students move from the associate to baccalaureate degree, they often have to retake courses that they already took at the associate degree level that had similar content. And so how is it that we can really provide seamless pathways, really lean into articulation and transfer, really think about credit for prior learning and how that can connect into higher education? And so building those pathways. And we also, just as other professions, there's an expectation that programs will be accredited by the profession as well. And so I'll talk about that in a minute. I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about it. But this notion that as professional preparation programs, we should be recognized and be held accountable for meeting the standards of the profession. We also recognize there are a lot of supports that need to be in place for higher education programs. They are as under-resourced and undervalued as early childhood educators themselves, and we have got to make some tracks into changing that. And so there are a number of recommendations around infrastructure and supports that are named both for faculty specifically, thinking about program structure, as well as for what our students need to. And I heard some conversation around that too when I came in. But really thinking about, we are a clinical profession, but we are not resourced like other clinical professional preparation programs in higher education. And so really tackling the faculty student ratios, because most of our faculty right now are teaching, as you all know, they are supervising field experiences and they are administering their program too. And it results in some really unreasonable faculty student ratios. And so how do we help build up the number of faculty and programs so that they can provide the support that they want to provide to their students, as well as really be able to lean into continuous improvement efforts within their program. Making sure that our current faculty and our pipeline into the faculty is diverse, and so that it really is reflective of the students who we are preparing and reflective of the communities that we are preparing our early childhood educators for. At the program level, one of the thorniest issues, I think, is really around field experience quality and just the challenges we have around being able to access quality field experiences, being able to provide the resources we want to for our mentor and cooperating teachers. Most of our programs don't have resources to be able to pay cooperating teachers, and that makes it really challenging to recruit and really challenging for them to ask the cooperating teachers and mentor teachers to provide the support that the students need during that time. And resources for programs to really invest in whether it's accreditation or other continuous improvement efforts, but that time to build the curriculum they want to build, make the curriculum shifts they want to make, where knowledge and practice is always changing and updating our field, and curriculum needs to reflect that. But that also takes time to do that work, to think about the content and the assignments and the assessments that are going to be part of the programs. And on this, yes.
This is wonderful, thorough information, and I'm just doing a time check, noticing that we have a little bit of time that I want to make sure folks can ask questions and engage in a little bit of discussion around your presentation. So maybe you want to take just a minute or two to wrap up. Thank you. I'm sorry for interrupting.
No worries. So I'll just say, student supports, and I heard conversation today, recognizing that many of our students are first generation students. And so, thinking about how do we design programs so that they can be successful to move through this? How do we have flexible program models? So, I think back to the point about when we tackle compensation, that is going to have a ripple effect across higher education too, right? That's going to help us tackle our recruitment issues in our early childhood higher ed programs. It will help raise our visibility with our higher ed leaders, and so increase the respect and recognition from higher ed leaders, which then hopefully takes our programs off the chopping block for that. So there's, as we tackle compensation, we will also see really good things happening in our higher ed programs as well. And I will, I will end there. I had a little bit about a higher ed accreditation, but thank you, Connecticut. You are making those investments. We really appreciate it. And so I'll just stop there.
All right, so we'll open up the floor to any questions for Mary. Commissioner Bai, go ahead.
Yeah, Mary, thanks so much for that. As states try to take some of what NAYC has been doing, because we now have all of our higher ed institutions committed to NAYC higher ed accreditation. We have a quality improvement system sort of built on the national structure of NAYC and NAFCC accreditation. But our statutes around higher ed are so complex that they really need a reboot related to qualified staff member. And, we need to look at those and are looking at them. But I understood that NAYC was going to have some model legislation that they worked with higher ed on and other stakeholder groups to help guide states. And it feels like we'd be right in the wheelhouse for that, given our commitment to NAYC higher ed accreditation, to power to the profession, and to program accreditation. Do you have a sense of when that will be available?
It will be available very soon. So one of the pieces
I've been hearing that. You sound like me now. You sound like I sound when people say, when will you roll out that program? And I say, very soon. We're almost there.
So I will say there is a commission. So part of the unifying framework, they recommended setting up a governance body for our profession. And so that is our Commission on Professional Excellence in Early Childhood Education. It has a lot of the national organizations that were part of Power to the Profession, as well as some others. We're getting ready to seat educators on that commission, but that commission has just approved the model legislation. There's a little bit of cleanup work that we need to do, just final edits, but that will be available as a resource very soon. And for that, there's also connected to that a set of regulations as well. So that'll be the next set that the commission approves. So that, it will be coming through. It's a starting place. We know, states will not just take and adopt, but it's at least a starting place to think about, well, what, this licensure system, what does that mean? And so in legislative language, here's what it could look like.
Right, but I think for us, it's been through a significant vetting process with providers, with participant students, with so we're going to have to go through that process. So better to start something with something that's already been through that process. Thanks.
Georgia, go ahead.
Hi, Mary.
Hey, Georgia.
We're back together again. Do you have any information about apprenticeship across the state and the work that folks are doing around apprenticeship? I know when we started our apprenticeship model, we worked to align it to the ECE level 1 with guidance from Deb Adams from the OEC. And we found that apprenticeship model really did fit in nicely and created a stackable or could potentially create a stackable credential towards that ECE level 2, moving towards an associate degree. So do you know if what work is being done around apprenticeship and how those apprenticeship are aligning with the ECE level 1?
Yeah, I would point you to Pennsylvania as a really good example of doing some deep work around that, both at the associate and baccalaureate degree level. Like, so I think to your point about how do you want these to result, when the ECE1, that it can stack into credit for the associate degree and then credit for the baccalaureate. So that they would be a great resource to connect with. ESEPS, which I cannot remember it's the acronym, but Randy Wolf out in California is doing significant work across many states around this as well, at the ECE 1 and 2 levels, where they really are taking the standards and competencies and building their programs around those. I think that, for apprenticeships, whether it's apprenticeships or teacher residencies, I think the components of what makes work-based programs is what we have to keep in mind for all professional preparation programs, right? This notion of allowing our students to be able to work in their own settings for at least that practicum or that student teaching portion, having some compensation that's connected to that piece, and having the supervised, like a really intentional supervision of those experiences. I think, whether that's through a formal apprenticeship or student or residency program, or just components we can build into all of our professional preparation programs is really important.
Paige and then Stephen.
Hi, Mary.
Hey,
Always a pleasure. Just want to clarify one thing, and I don't know that you'll know this now, but thinking about the way other states have aligned licensure and credentials to developmental periods. So are there other states with a birth to 8? Are there other states with a birth to 5? Are there other states with a, pre-K to grade 3 and elementary actually starts in grade 4? Any information you have on that would be super helpful to at least our subcommittee.
Great. Well, we can circle back with more information, but the answer is yes. Like, there are some birth to 8. Now, I think about Missouri, so there are states, and I don't know if Connecticut does too. They have a birth to 8, but they also have, I think, a K to 4 or something. There's multiple credentials that fall within that birth to 8. And so not as many people go through the birth through 8 license because the salary is in the K4 or the K5 licensure band there. So we can share some information about how other states have approached or currently are approaching licensure.
Thank you.
I think it's me next, right? Jessica. Hi, Mary. My name's
Hi.
Stephen Hegedus. I'm a Dean of Education here at Southern Connecticut State University. I'm also the state chapter president of AACTE. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
I worked for them for many years.
Okay.
So.
Yeah. And soon to be passing the baton on after many years, but we're preparing and meeting with our legislators as we speak prior to the legislative session. And so anything that you can share with us, even in draft form, that would help us to review and prepare for our conversations, I'd be grateful. I know you said it was coming soon, but even if there's things that, or even we could talk about, that would be very helpful, because I think there is certainly in our plans much work to be done in that space, as the Commissioner Bai mentioned, with regards to our state statutes and regulations. I had a question. What does the $ equal in your slide? I think that's sort of the bottom. That's a big multi-million-dollar question. Have you got any suggestions, ballpark averages, or thoughts on what those the three tiers that you presented should be at? I know you mentioned alignment with public school, but I think that first level is critical to have at least something to promote, and to build from in those second and third tiers. Do you have any? Yeah, any?
Yeah, we did not name specific dollar figures related to if you're an ECE1. I mean, the notion is that as you move across the designations, compensation increases. And so that was the main intention, because we recognized in every state the compensation will look different, just I think based on cost of living within the state. So we did not kind of set a floor in terms of a specific dollar amount for those.
Okay, thank you.
Meryl, go ahead.
So, yeah, my question is again sort of about compensation. The parity between, say, in Connecticut, you have to have an associate's degree typically to become a paraprofessional in public school, and that's would associate with the ECE2. I've just in the past week heard about early educators leaving for $4 and $5 an hour raises, becoming paraprofessionals in public schools. Now, typically public school teachers, paras work a 10-month year, and public and early educators are working year round. How were you thinking about that kind of difference of a longer year versus?
Yeah, I mean, I think those would be taken into the calculations. So, that if it is a 12, a year round, that needs to be taken into consideration, and that we would not equate 10 months and 12 months, like that there would be a bump there. But again, we didn't go into specific dollar amounts in the framework, but wanted to just provide some guiding principles around what to consider with that.
Thanks.
Mary, are there any states, in addition to Paige's question about models for licensure to look at, are there any states that are really tackling compensation and funding and that we could look at and explore?
I think Alabama is a good place to look. But they really are trying to address pay parity for their preschool educators. So both those in publicly and privately funded preschools. So that's a place to look for that. I will also connect with my colleague Lauren Hogan. I think she may be talking to some of you later on today. And in fact, we were just saying, we're both talking to Connecticut today. But I think she's that conversation is going to be around more on the compensation pieces, and she's been doing work with states around that.
Thank you so much, Mary, for this information. I'm seeing that we're about at actually our stopping point for the task force meeting. So thank you, Mary. And if any other questions have come up for anyone, please share them with Marcia and I, and we could reach out. Mary, would you be willing to share through email your PowerPoint presentation that we can put in our repository for the task force?
I am. I just put my email in there, and I'll send you the slides, and feel free to share this.
Perfect. Thank you. So I know that we were, as a task force, going to spend a little bit of time for subcommittees to share questions or ask each other, process any information, but we are at noon. So that will be something we will need to bracket enough time for in our next meeting. Are there any other things that anyone here wants to raise before we end today?
I just have one comment that I wanted to make, because all roads really, I think, are coming back to compensation. And so I guess I have a bit of a question is, how in the remaining time that we have left, do we really spend some time talking about that? And secondly, I wanted to point out the work that the OEC has already done with a compensation scale. I think Beth, third sector, worked with the OEC on the compensation salary scale and that. So I would suggest that maybe we take a look at what has already been created as a platform for this committee, this task force to really include a solid recommendation around compensation being a key issue for the future workforce in early childhood education. So I think we have a good body of work that we could at least take a look at. I know there are a lot of questions about, the last presentation about dollars and assigned to different levels. And if I'm recalling correctly, the compensation scale that I've seen from the OEC does look to get parity with public school educators' salaries. And it does have some gradations in it for increases. So I would just like to raise that as a piece of work that the committee, this task force, could take a look at.
Thank you, Karen. And I want to recognize that we have the subcommittee that Georgia is co-chairing or chairing to specifically tackle the question of compensation. And Karen, are you requesting that maybe at the next task force meeting that we have a specific dialogue or presenter that is maybe sharing some data around this? Yeah.
Yeah, I would suggest that. I'm not, I know that there's subcommittee, but I think this is really going to pop out as a large recommendation from this group. So I think it might be worthwhile for us, all of us, to kind of sink our teeth into it so that we can look at coming up with a solid recommendation. January is going to roll around quickly. And so I just think we should take a look at a body of work that already exists. It might be something that we want to, use or make some adaptations to, but there is at least a starting point.
Awesome. Thanks, Karen.
I strongly support that idea. I think we need to dedicate a good chunk of time at our next meeting on that, with the work from OEC as well that they've done, and Georgia's group.
And Karen, to your point in not reinventing the wheel, I think OEC spent a significant amount of time developing that. And from our committee perspective, our work was really focused around how do we actually find the funding to make that happen. And so instead of us trying to figure out, where to start, is to say, how do we fund it? And I think that's really what we need to figure out, because I think, again, the work has been done. We have a starting point. It hasn't figured out all of the details, but we can use it as a starting point. But I think what would be helpful is for us, for the next committee meeting, is to examine all of the different possible ways that we can fund this, because Connecticut has some really wonderful infrastructure for funding childcare. We know that the only question is, will legislators make the monies available? And depending on the infrastructure tool that we use, we're going to have to kind of figure that out as it relates to parents' choices and equity. But I think, Karen, you're right. We should really look at what OEC has presented, and from our task force perspective, we were just looking at how this can be funded.
Jessica, before we go, can I just, to all of that, and Ken, please ask any and all of us to help. Jessica, Marcia, help. We really need a place where we can have common information, especially now that we have the mechanisms to ask for data. It's making me feel the time crunch. So I don't know. I feel like if there's an official way to do that, great. Otherwise, we all know there's 10,000 technological ways we could make that happen. So I'd be so grateful if we could wrap that this week. So as our subcommittees meet, we also have visibility on the data and what's coming in.
Ken, if you could give us some guidance on, my understanding is that we would be waiting for your office to be able to put that together, but can we just pull that in a Google folder that is shared amongst the task forces, or how can we go about doing that?
Yeah, I'm not sure if everyone's seen it before, and I can definitely share it in the chat. But there's already a the website
Okay.
is available. That's the Taskforce on Early Childhood Workforce Development. So, that's where I have other docs that have already been shared. Membership, the
Okay.
contact information.
So I think Ken, the audio is a little choppy, but I think Ken says that it exists. And so can we, if you could put if there is a link that we can put, that we have access to uploading documents, or do we need to send them to you to upload?
Yeah, you would have to go through me to upload documents.
Okay. All right. So any materials that any subcommittees receive to send, you could send them to Ken and copy Marcia and I, or you could send them to Marcia and I, and we will share them with Ken so that they can land there. Thank you, Ken.
Thank you.
Can I just ask Maggie really very quickly, is the compensations is the wage scale that OEC created, is that available at this point to share publicly? I don't know, Maggie, if you can answer that.
Sorry, that was a question for me.
Yes.
It is very near being finalized. It was considered draft because we didn't want to assume that this was a final compensation schedule until we had kind of vetted it with the field, kind of a soft viewing. We shared it with Representative Bobby Sanchez last March, I believe. It has gone through some revisions, I think just to improve it based on what feedback we've gotten from the field. So I don't know, I'll check back about next steps, whether there's going to be a little bit more vetting before it is finalized and submitted to the legislature.
Do you know if it's a document that we can use at least as a beginning framework for the next conversation?
It's been publicly shared. I mean, yes, I mean, you have it. It's not, I would consider it still please draft. There has not been significant changes to the schedule itself. I don't think any changes to the schedule. It's more some other parts of the report that needed finalization. So yeah, it has been shared. So, it is known, it's a known quantity, just that it's in a draft form.
Okay.
Okay, if there are no, yes, Stephen, you're saying bye. Okay, there's any further questions, we will adjourn.